Okay, I'm going to mix some subjects here again. I'm going to talk about medieval commerce, but specifically how the sensibilities of what some have called the commercial revolution of the Middle Ages feed some of the key cultural trends of this period, specifically the rise of the Mendicant orders. And so, if you don't know what the Mendicant orders are, I will talk about that, of course, in this lecture. So, a number of important works of scholarship have been done over the past several decades on the growth of trade and commerce. Some of these have focused on Europe itself, for instance, and they have talked about things that we've already discussed in this class. The impact of the population growth and the kind of climatic and political stability of this period. The attendant urbanization, and especially the growth of large cities in places like northern Italy and the Low Countries, and that these become the nerve centers. That's actually a terminology by the scholar Robert Lopez, whose book The Commercial Revolution of the Middle Ages was one of the starting points for this, you might say. And so, these cities became drivers of the growth of trade, and in terms of like the mercantile practices as well as the growth of industry. Italy, in particular, produced by the 12th and 13th centuries a fairly high quality wool cloth that was in demand not only in Europe. This is actually one of the first products that Europeans were able to produce that they could sell for a handsome profit outside of this, right? So other scholars have kind of picked up on that and have talked about the growth of world trade during this period. And Europe is an extension of this, of a much broader set of trade networks that you can see here, right? The heartland of the World Trade Network, or the locus point, the center, is Central Asia, right? Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara and Balkh. These are the center of this thing that broadly is called the Silk Road, running from China over here and India. And of course, you have the Himalaya Mountains up here, which are an imposing obstacle, but running through these cities and then into the various political entities in the Middle East, what remained of the Abbasid Caliphate, and especially by the period of the Crusades, the Ayyubid Sultanate, which was Saladin's creation, or really it's Nur ad-Din's creation, but Saladin's the one who kind of pushed it to its heights. And so, extending into cities like Damascus and Antioch and the Crusader cities over here, but also moving through the Arabian Peninsula. Some of these are sea routes, of course, up through the Red Sea and through the Persian Gulf to places like Baghdad, overland into Anatolia, and then through the Red Sea to Cairo and Alexandria, right? And so, the Silk Road and these broader trading networks link in Europe, and Europe is able to supply goods to these things. This is aided by the growth of international contacts via the Crusades. That despite the conflict, this actually serves to spur increased trade between Europe and North Africa, the Middle East, and points beyond. And so we have these global trade routes, right? Mentioned European products, particularly high-quality wool cloth. In the early Middle Ages, the number one thing that Europeans had to offer to the rest of the world were actually slaves. And that continued to a small extent in the High Middle Ages, but there are shifting notions about freedom and unfreedom, and Europeans are no longer as willing, or as this was not as common a practice, to sell their fellow human beings as chattel slaves. It varied region by region, but you don't tend to see that much. There are, of course, we talked about this already, the creation of these trading alliances like the Hansa, the Hanseatic League. You can see Lübeck and Hamburg up here, right, which were some of the founding partners of this, extending down into places like Magdeburg and over to London, and even over here to places like Riga and Danzig, right, in what is now Latvia and Poland. These were connected in with these trading alliances. You have the Lombard League in Italy, which was partly a defensive alliance, but it did help to spur, partnerships between the different cities, so they had rivalries too. And so that, helps to grow commerce additionally. Now, the thing I really want to talk about is the effect that this has on the society and the culture of Europe in this period. Europe got access by being more connected to these broader trading networks, gained greater and greater access to goods that had simply not been in existence in Europe up to this point, right? Particularly luxury goods. And by luxury goods, we mean things that only the very wealthy, for the most part, can afford, right? Perhaps number one in this regard was spices. Europe did not, the diet of the people of Europe was, certainly by modern standards, incredibly bland, right? The staple was grain, wheat or barley or something like that would be probably, in some cases, made into bread or brewed into beer, maybe most commonly ground and then boiled in water to make a porridge or a gruel. And the only thing that they had to flavor this, for the most part, was fruit during the season when fruit was in, and perhaps a little bit of salt, depending on the place, right? There are some salt deposits in Europe, but they didn't have sugar. They didn't have any other spices really native to Europe, or at least not many. And so when things like pepper and cloves and cinnamon and other spices, which were grown in other far-flung parts of the world, began to make it into Europe via these larger trade routes, Europeans, especially elite Europeans who could afford these things, developed a taste for this, right? And it's because their diet was just so bland. And if they're, eating meat, the meat, with the lack of refrigeration and all of that, the meat would spoil rather quickly. And so if you salt it heavily and spice it with pepper and things like that, it remains palatable for a longer time. And so spices were a luxury good. Another one was silk. For the most part, up until the High Middle Ages, silk is only produced in China. Silkworms are domesticated animals, and so other peoples are able to get their hands on silkworms, and the production of silk moves further and further west. By the late Middle Ages, they're actually producing silk in places like Italy. But silk is still very much an Asian product, right? And it's called the Silk Road for a reason. Silk was a commodity in high demand. And so as these elites developed a taste for these luxury goods and, would do anything to procure the luxury goods, this changed their economic and social relationship with others, particularly those who were beholden to them in some way because they were dependents, because they were serfs, or because they were tenant farmers, working land that was leased to them by the nobility, by the elites. And over time, this is not universal, but it tended to be the case that, in the early Middle Ages and perhaps in the first part of this period, proceeds, the dues that were owed, taxes, tolls, tithes, things like that, were paid in kind. That meant that the peasants grew grain or grew wine grapes or whatever it was, depending on the region they're in, and they would give a good portion of that to the lord who controlled the land, and that he would then be responsible for doing something with it, probably selling the surplus somewhere else. Increasingly, lords began to demand not payment in kind, but payment in actual money. And so this grows the use of currency. And they wanted money because they, of course, wanted to buy these luxury goods. They didn't want to have to take the added step of selling the produce or something like that. And so this forced the peasants to take initiative. They had to do this, right? To procure money, they had to go and sell their produce somewhere. And we see the development of institutions like fairs and urban markets where the peasants could take their wares, sell them, get money, pay off their taxes and tolls, and then maybe buy something at the fair. And these commoners are getting involved in trade and the use of currency, and so this shifts social relations in important ways. And that's only one kind of effect, but that's a major one. And again, this goes back and forth even into the early modern period. The relationship between the dominant landholders, usually the nobility, the commoners, who are the vast majority of the population but own very little of the land, and things like money and global trade, right? This is always a shifting relationship between those three things. There are also ethical and, we might say, spiritual consequences of the growth of commerce and trade. Europeans, because they were Christian, from the earliest period of Christianity, had an ambivalent relationship, at times even an inimical relationship with money. And there's an excellent, exhaustive study by Peter Brown about the Christian reaction to and attitudes toward money in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, called The Eye of a Needle, or Through the Eye of a Needle, or something like that. It's taken from the parable of Jesus, where he talks about the rich man is more likely to, a camel can pass through the eye of a needle more likely than a rich man can get into heaven. But this relationship is fraught. The relationship between Christian belief and money. Obviously, people needed money and used money who were Christian, but money was also considered the root of evils. Radix malorum omnium est avaritia, right? That's the Latin, or it's some version of that. The root of all evils is greed, and greed, of course, is closely associated with money. And so, with the growth of commerce, with the increased wealth that some people had, with the increase in the use of currency and the fact that money became a common possession and something that people thought about and strove for throughout their lives, this created no end of consternation among devout Christians. Like, this is not something that is good for our souls, was the opinion of many people. One key result from this, and I'm taking off from an important study done all the way back in the 1970s by the scholar Lester K. Little, which is called, his book was called the Profit, Religious Poverty and the Profit Economy, or something like that. And he makes this link between the growth of, and the title, the profit economy, right? The use of money, the increase in commerce, and this desire for poverty. Now, contained in the Bible, and especially in the teachings of Jesus, and texts like the famous Sermon on the Mount from Matthew chapter 5 through 7, is this idea that a true follower of Jesus will not worry at all about his or her possessions. Consider the lilies of the field, Jesus says to his disciples, right? How they grow, they don't labor, and yet God has arrayed these more finely than King Solomon in all his glory. God will provide, and we need to be reliant on God and have faith that God will provide, and instead of concerning ourselves over much with the pursuit of money and of sustenance, we ought to leave it in the hands of God. right? This is a rather radical sentiment, but it lies at the heart of Christian teaching. And so some people in this period with the growth of commercialism take that approach. The chief example here is, well, actually, let me back up and make one more point before I talk about the person I'm going to talk about. There was a tradition, and the term I've got, that we got going here is the term mendicant. This comes from, this is related to the word world. It's also kind of has a sense of wandering, okay? There were clergymen who combined the life of monks with interaction with people in the world. Going back through the centuries of the Middle Ages, there were these figures called canons regular. But regular means they lived by a rule, meaning they lived an existence like monks, but often they might live in the equivalent of a monastery. This would be called a canonry, but it might be organized very much like a monastery. And the canons regular, would sometimes leave their monastery to provide pastoral care to the surrounding community. They might also be connected to a church or a cathedral, and they would supply the bureaucracy and the spiritual laborers, so to speak, for a church. And so they combine they are secular clerics, but they live like monks. They live like regular clerics. And so that's a precedent here. The mendicant orders that rise in the late 12th and early 13th centuries take that as a model, but they push it even further. They emphasize. The canons regular did pastoral care and provided services to the secular sphere, just partly out of necessity, but not as a key focus to their existence. Right? They would want to be cloistered, want to be cut off from the world primarily. The mendicants, on the other hand, actively go into the world with the sense that they can truly change the world for the better, right? And there are two figures who are associated with this. The first of these is Francis of Assisi. The second is Dominic Guzman. Let me just talk about Francis first. This is actually believed to be the earliest depiction of Francis. This dates from right at the end of his life, maybe a couple of years after his death. It's a fresco. You can see the word Franciscus here. Francis of Assisi has a really interesting biography. He was the son of a wealthy merchant in the city of Assisi in central Italy, in the region called Umbria. And he had lived a rather dissolute existence early in life. His father had made so much money that he was, able to purchase Francis a title and essentially make him a knight. Francis had even gotten caught up in the fervor over crusading, but that was, this led to some misadventures. When Francis was in his early 20s, though, he had a spiritual epiphany, and there are different versions of his life. The really famous one's written by Thomas of Cantimpré, or Thomas Celano. Sorry, Thomas of Cantimpré is he's in the Devozione Moderna. Thomas of Celano, and there are other kind of lives about Francis, but they universally talk about his conversion, right? That he became disenchanted with the pursuit of wealth. Now, one thing that's interesting that I should mention here, in an earlier video, I talked about Herbert Grunmann's phrase, religious movements, or that's the rubric that he uses to identify the growth of heresy. Well, he also applies it to these mendicant orders, right? There is not much difference in the message of Peter Valdez from the message of Francis of Assisi. Maybe the key difference is the biography and the personality of these two figures. I mentioned that Peter Valdez, rejected wealth and tried to live as a wandering beggar hermit. Francis essentially decided to do the same thing, but unlike Peter Valdez, Francis was patient and did not actively preach what he was doing until he received official sanction from the church hierarchy. He was never critical of the church hierarchy, even if they lived lives that were far removed from the life of voluntary poverty that he pursued, right? Francis was also an incredibly disarming and charming individual. A lot of speculation has been done that he may be on the autism spectrum somewhere, or have some kind of mental illness that accounts for his childlike nature. But he did charm people, including Pope Innocent III, who granted him an audience and gave him permission to write up a rule for his order and to found a new order of a new religious order, which would be a very different kind of thing than anything that was had come before that, right? Francis became the founder of this thing called the Order of Friars Minor. And they wore gray robes, very simple and rough gray robes, and they lived a life of voluntary poverty, according to the rule of St. Francis, which is one of the sources assigned for this week, and we'll look at that in a second video, so I don't want to talk too much about it here. But, a Franciscan should not own anything of himself. He should have no personal property. The very possession of anything, right, was inevitably going to lead to greed and to a kind of attachment to a physical object, was the opinion of St. Francis. And so he wrote up this rule and really won the hearts of so many people, right? It's the heart of St. Francis, I think, more than anything, that was so impressive to others. He was just so sincere in his commitment to living as Jesus, literally living as Jesus had instructed his disciples to live. And he gained quite a following. After some initial resistance, certainly from his father, and even from some churchmen, although the Bishop of Assisi was on his side from the beginning, right? He was able to win over the church hierarchy. And as I said, Innocent III gave him permission to write up a rule and to start this religious order. But importantly, right, the Franciscans lived as wandering hermits. They tried to beg for their sustenance. They eventually did found houses, which we would call friaries, right? The word friar is the word applied to mendicants. They, so they weren't living like ascetic hermits like many had done in the Middle Ages up to this point. They're living in communities. They're just doing it in a condition of poverty and an utter rejection of the world. But of course, people found the Franciscans admirable and they wanted instruction, and the Franciscans were willing to provide pastoral care. And so, over time, this emphasis on voluntary poverty as the central tenet of the order gets not entirely crowded out, but there are lots of other concerns. In fact, the last 2-3 years of his life, St. Francis himself withdrew from the order and even said, I am Francis, but I'm not a Franciscan, right? He was really disenchanted with the way things were going. And later in the history of the order, by the end of the 13th century, the beginning of the 14th century, those who insisted upon a literal reading of the rule of St. Francis and a literal commitment to the things that Francis, at least according to them, seems to have stood for, the voluntary poverty, the absolute rejection of all possessions, right? This was taken as a criticism of the church itself, right, which had wealth and opulence. And so those who were most committed to this, most literal in their reading of that, ended up being essentially broken off of the main part of the order and eventually were deemed heretics. And there are some leaders among that group who were, kind of considered arch heretics. Some of them had been renowned theologians and, key men of their day. Some of them are even condemned posthumously after their death, right? And so there are all sorts of issues that arise. By the 14th century, the spiritual Franciscans, as they're called, were considered one of the most notorious groups of heretics, notorious and dangerous groups of heretics in all of Europe. Briefly, let's talk about the Dominicans. This is another mendicant order. So they live. It combines the living a life according to a rule and living a life like monks, but with a focus on providing pastoral care. The founder of the Dominican order was a Castilian clergyman named Dominic Guzman. This is a stained glass window of Dominic, though the stained glass is modern. Okay, it actually has some really interesting features to it. One of the things you'll note here is that there's a dog next to Dominic. That's because the Dominicans became known as the dogs of the Lord, the Canes Domini. And the dog itself is carrying a torch in its mouth, right? Because the Dominicans, torches and fire, these are representative of intelligence and light and truth and things like that. And the Dominicans became the major proponents in Europe of Christian education. And that continued all through the Middle Ages. Dominic is also standing on I assume, what is a biblical book, but maybe not. Not sure exactly what's going on with the book there. In any case, Dominic, started out as a clergyman. I think he was a priest, though I'm not sure about that. He may have been a monk. And this is in a period when penitential practices were becoming more and more elaborate. Things like saying the Rosary in devotion to the Virgin Mary, right, dates back from this period. There's also a growing devotion to the Eucharist, which culminates in 1264 in the establishment of the Feast of Corpus Christi, which becomes an incredibly popular feast. And so there's a lot of development of these religious practices, especially those focused on penitence. Pilgrimage is still incredibly popular as a penitential practice, but lots of other things are added to this. More and more prayers and segments of the Mass that are devoted to wailing over one's sins and things like this. Okay, an elaboration of the liturgy focused on penitence. And Dominic saw penitence and the true knowledge of God as the cure for what ailed Christendom at the time, right? The Christian world was being threatened in the early 13th century by a number of outside forces. The Crusades were not going well, of course, but the early 13th century also saw the appearance of the Mongols on the eastern horizon, and they made it as far as Hungary. And Dominic ended up going to the Pope and asking him for permission to be sent off to preach to the Mongols. Dominic probably felt that he wanted to die a martyr's death, and that would give him a good opportunity to do so. But he also seems to have believed in his heart of hearts that a true knowledge of the Christian God would lead to conversion and people changing their lives. The Pope didn't want to sacrifice Dominic to the Mongols. Instead, he sent him to southern France to preach to the Cathars. And Dominic went there along with some who followed him in this lifestyle. They did not have a tremendous amount of success converting the Cathars back to Catholicism, but he did earn the respect of many people on these missionary journeys, and the Dominicans over time came to be a key educational arm of the church. They're called the Ordo Praedicorum, the Order of Preachers. Again, the emphasis is on preaching and education, making sure that everyone is taught the correct Christian doctrine. But this makes them also really good staffers for things like the Inquisition, because they understand the true doctrine and they're able to ferret out heresy really well, right? And this is one of the reasons why the Dominicans are called the dogs of the Lord, the Canes Domini. And so, the Dominicans gained this reputation for their educational standing. There was a prescribed educational itinerary or trajectory for Dominicans. They had to master not only the Bible with its ordinary glosses, as we've talked about, but also important theological works like the 4 books of sentences of Peter the Lombard and the Historia Scholastica of Peter Comester. These are texts that we've talked about a little bit. They even had to, and if they could, procure personal copies of these or make copies of them for themselves and carry them with them as they went on itinerant preaching. By the mid-13th century, the Dominicans became some of the primary scholars at the emerging universities and other educational institutions in Europe. The University of Paris, in particular, became very much a Dominican enclave. Figures like Albertus Magnus, and especially his student Thomas Aquinas, were both Dominicans, and there were lots of other prestigious Dominicans in these educational institutions. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I think that was the last point I wanted to make about that. I will pick up more about the Mendicants when the next video. I want to talk through some of the primary sources in the Geary book that have to do with the Dominicans, including, with the Franciscans and Dominicans, including the rule of St. Francis and the hagiographic literature around St. Dominic. But we'll save that for next time. Thanks.